Chapter 9. Sexual Plethora and Death. Reproductive activity seen as a form of growth. Eroticism taken as a whole is an infraction of the laws of taboos. It is a human activity. But although it begins when purely animal nature ends, its foundation is animal nonetheless. Human nature may turn from the foundation in horror, but allows it to persist at the same time, and so effectively that the expression bestiality is continually linked with eroticism. It is false to imagine that breaking the sexual taboos means a return to nature as exemplified in the animals, and yet the behaviour forbidden by the taboos is like that of animals. Physical sexuality, always accompanying eroticism, is to it what the brain is to the mind. Physiology remains the material basis of thought in just the same way. We must include the animal's sexual function with the rest of the data if we are to put our inner experience of eroticism in its proper place in objective reality, and even give it our first attention. Indeed, the sexual functions of animals have aspects which bring us close to the inner experience as we consider them attentively. In order, then, to get at the inner experience, we shall now discuss physical conditions. In the fields of objective reality, life always brings into play, except when there is impotence, an excess of energy which must be expended, and this superabundance is in fact either used up in the growth of the unity envisaged, or it is quite simply wasted. Footnote: all this is clear if we look at society's economic activity. The organism's activity is more elusive. There is always a connection between growth and the development of sexual functions, both dependent on hypophysis. We cannot measure the calorie expenditure of the organism regularly enough to be sure which of the two ends it serves, growth or genetic activity. But hypophysis appropriates energy now for the development of sexual functions and now for growth. So gigantism impedes sexual functioning, and precocious puberty might coincide with arrested growth, though this is open to doubt. Hence, sexuality has a certain ambiguity. Even sexual activity independent of its genetic ends is no less essentially governed with growth. Taken together, the gonads grow. To have a clear picture of this process, we must go back to scissiparity, the simplest mode of reproduction. The scissiparous organism does grow, but once it is grown, the single organism will one day or another split into two. Let us call the original cell A, the two cells it splits into AA and AAA. Then the transition from the first state to the second is not independent of the growth of A, as AA plus AAA, compared with the earlier states represented by A, signifies the growth of the latter. What we must note is that AA, although other than AAA, is not any more than the latter other than A. Something of A persists in AA. Something of A persists in AAA. I shall return to the disconcerting nature of a growth which calls the unity of the growing organism in question, but for the present let us note this, that reproduction is nothing but a form of growth. In general, this is clear from the multiplication of individuals, the most obvious result of sexual activity. But growth of the species and sexual reproduction is only one aspect of reproduction in primitive scissiparity, in the sphere of asexual reproduction. Like all the cells of the individual organism, sexual gonads are scissiparous. At bottom, every living unity grows. If in growing it attains a state of plethora, it can divide, but growth or plethora is the condition of that division which, in the world of living things, we call reproduction. The growth of the whole and the contribution of individuals. Objectively, making love is a question of reproduction. Hence, following our reasoning, it is growth, but not our growth. Neither sexual activity nor cisparity provide for the growth of the being itself engaged on reproduction, whether it copulates or more simply divides. Reproduction brings about an impersonal growth. The fundamental contrast referred to in the first place between loss and growth can therefore be seen in terms of another difference, where impersonal growth as opposed to sheer loss stands against personal growth. There is no basic selfish growth unless the individual grows without changing. If the growth is for the benefit of a being or a group beyond the individual, it is no longer a growth but a contribution, and for the individual making it, it is a loss of his substance. The giver will find himself again in the gift, but he must give first of all. He must first of all renounce more or less completely whatever is needed for the growth of the whole. Death and continuity in asexual and sexual reproduction. We must first take a close look at the situation brought about by division. Within the asexual organism A, there was continuity. When AA and AAA appeared, the continuity was not immediately done away. Whether it vanished at the beginning or at the end of the crisis is unimportant, but there was a moment of suspense. At that moment, that which was not yet AA was continuous with AAA, but the plethora was threatening this continuity. The plethora of what initiates the glide toward the division of the organism, but it divides at the very moment, the moment of the glide, the critical moment when the two beings about to become separate at any minute are still not yet so. The crisis of separation springs from the plethora. It is not separation yet, but a state of ambiguity. In the plethora, the organism passes from the calm of repose to a state of violent agitation, a turbulent agitation which lays hold of the total being in its continuity. But the violence of agitation which at first takes place within the being's continuity calls forth the violence of separation from which discontinuity proceeds. Calm returns when the separation is complete and two distinct beings exist side by side. The plethora of the cell which leads to these circumstances, to the creation of one, of two new beings, is rudimentary compared with the plethora of the male and female organs ending in the climax of sexual reproduction. But both crises have essential aspects in common. Both originate in superabundance. Both are bound up with the growth of the group of beings reproducing and reproduced, and in both there is the disappearance of the individual. Immortality is wrongly ascribed to dividing cells. Cell A survives in neither AA nor AAA. AA is not the same as A or AAA. In fact, during the division, A ceases to be. A disappears. A dies. It leaves no trace, no corpse, but die it does. The plethora of the cell ends in creative death, in the solution of the crisis in which appears the continuity of the new beings, AA and AAA, originally one and the same, and now escaping into their final separation from each other. The significance of this last aspect, common to both modes of reproduction, is of cardinal importance. The overall continuity of beings is pushed to the limit in both cases. Objectively speaking, this continuity is given by one being to another, and by each to the totality of the others in the transitions of the reproductive process. But death is always fatal to individual discontinuity, and it appears whenever a deep continuity is revealed. Asexual reproduction conceals it at the same time as it invites it. Here the dead individual disappears in death, is spirited away. In this sense, asexual reproduction is death's ultimate truth. Death proclaims the fundamental discontinuity of beings and of existence itself. The discontinuous being alone dies, and death lays bare the falsehood of discontinuity. A return to inner experience. In sexual types of reproduction, individual discontinuity is a more robust affair. The The discontinuous being does not disappear altogether when he dies, but leaves traces that may even last forever. A skeleton may last millions of years. At the highest level, the sexual being is tempted, indeed, obliged to believe in the immortality of his separate existence. He looks upon his soul, his discontinuity, as the deepest truth of his own being, for he is taken in by the survival of his physical being, although this may be only partial and its constituent parts may decompose. Since bones are so durable, he has even invented the resurrection of the body. On the day of judgment, the bones are to come together and the resuscitated bodies bring the soul back to its original state. Here is an exaggeration of a physical condition in which continuity, no less fundamental in sexual reproduction, is lost. The genetic cells divide, and from one to another it is possible to have an objective understanding of the initial unity. Continuity underlying each Sisyphus division is always obvious. On the level of the discontinuity and the continuity of beings, the only new element in sexual reproduction is the fusion of the two minute entities, tiny cells, the male and female gametes. But the fusion makes the fundamental continuity finally plain. It shows that lost continuity can be found again. The discontinuousness of sexual beings gives rise to a dense and heavy world where individual separateness has terrifying foundations. The anguish of death and pain has bestowed on this wall of separation the solidity of prison walls, dismal and hostile. Yet within this unhappy world, lost continuity can be found again if fertilization takes place. Fertilization, fusion, that is, would be unthinkable if the apparent discontinuousness of the simplest animated beings were not an illusion. Only the discontinuousness of complex creatures seems intangible to begin with. We do not seem able to conceive of their discontinuity being reduced to a single unity, or of being doubled, or called into question. The moments of plethora when animals are in the grip of sexual fever are critical ones in their isolation. Then fear of death and pain is transcended. Then the sense of relative continuity between animals of the same species, always there in the background as a contradiction, though not a serious one, of apparent discontinuity is suddenly heightened. Curiously enough, this does not happen under exactly similar conditions between individuals of the same sex. It would seem that only a secondary difference has the power to bring a deep-seated identity which might have lain concealed to the surface of consciousness. Similarly, a loss is felt more intensely just as it takes place. The sex difference seems to stimulate this undefined sense of continuity due to similarity of race, while at the same time betraying it and making it hurtful. Perhaps one should not compare the reactions of animals with man's inner experience after thus discussing objective data. Science sees it in a simple light. Animal reaction is determined by physiological facts. Similarity of species is indeed a physiological fact for the observer, and difference of sex is another. But the notion of a similarity made more obvious by a difference is founded on some inner experience. All I can do is stress this change of emphasis in passing. It is characteristic of this work. I believe that a study with man as its subject is bound to make changes like this in places. A study that sets out to be scientific minimizes the part played by subjective experience, while I, on the other hand, am methodically minimizing that played by objective knowledge. Indeed, when I put forward the findings of science on reproduction, at the back of my mind I intend to transpose them. I know that I cannot undergo the inner experience of animals, still less of animalcula. No more can I imagine it. But animalcula have an inner experience just as complex animals do. The transition from existence in itself to existence for itself cannot be assigned exclusively to complex creatures or to mankind. Even an inert particle, lower down the scale than the animalcula, seems to have this existence for itself, though I prefer the words inside or inner experience. None of the terms used to describe it are wholly satisfactory. I cannot fail to know that this inner experience, which I can neither undergo myself nor picture in my imagination, implies by definition a feeling of self. This elementary feeling is not consciousness of self. Consciousness of self follows upon consciousness of external objects, only clearly known with humanity. But feeling of self necessarily varies as the self concerned withdraws into its discontinuity. This withdrawal is greater or lesser according to the facilities available for objective discontinuity, in inverse ratio to those available for continuity. The firmness and stability of a conceivable limit are important, but the feeling of self varies according to the degree of isolation. Sexual activity is a critical moment in the isolation of the individual. We know it from without, but we know that it weakens and calls into question the feeling of self. We use the word crisis, that is, the inner effect of an event known objectively. As an objective fact of knowledge, the crisis is nonetheless responsible for a basic inner phenomenon. General facts concerning sexual reproduction. The material basis of the crisis is the plethora. With asexual beings, this is clear straight away. There is growth. Growth determines reproduction, and consequently division, and the death of the plethoric individual. It is less clear in the realm of sexual beings, but a superabundance of energy is nonetheless a starting point for the activity of the sexual organs, and, just as for the simplest organisms, brings death in its train. Not directly, however. As a general rule, the sexual individual survives the superabundance, and even the excesses into which it leads him. Death is the result of the sexual crisis only in exceptional cases, but the significance of these is admittedly striking, so much so that the exhaustion following the final paroxysm is thought of as a little death. Humanly speaking, death is always the symbol of the retreating waters after the violence of the storm, but it is not only to be seen as a remote parallel. We must never forget that the multiplication of beings goes hand in hand with death. The parents survive the birth of their offspring, but the reprieve is only temporary. A stay is granted, partly for the benefit of the newcomers who need assistance, but the appearance of the newcomers guarantees the disappearance of their predecessors. Death follows reproduction with sexual beings too, at a distance, even if not immediately. Death is the inevitable consequence of superabundance. Only stagnation ensures that creatures shall preserve their discontinuity, their isolation, that is. This discontinuity is a challenge to the pressure that is bound to abolish the barriers keeping separate individuals apart. The forward surge of life may require the barriers temporarily, but without them, no complex organisation would be possible, no organisation effective. But life is movement, and nothing within the movement is proof against it. Asexual beings die of their own development and of their own impulsion. Sexual ones can put up only a temporary resistance to their own teeming energies as the general surge of life. True, occasionally what they succumb to is only the collapse of their own resources and metabolism, and there's no doubt about this. Only multiple death can resolve the dilemma of these ever-multiplying existences. The idea of a world where human life might be artificially prolonged has a nightmare quality, yet gives no glimpse of anything beyond that slight delay. Death is waiting in the long run, made necessary by multiplying and teeming life. A comparison of the two elementary aspects as seen objectively and subjectively. Those aspects of life in which reproduction is bound up with death are undeniably and objectively real, but as I have already said, even an elementary form of life has certainly a subjective experience of itself. We can even discuss this rudimentary experience while admitting that it is incommunicable. The crisis of existence is here. The being experiences being in the crisis that puts it to the test. The being's very being is called into question in the transition from continuity to discontinuity, or from discontinuity to continuity. We agree that the simplest organism is aware of itself and of its limits. If these limits alter, its basic consciousness is under attack, and this attack is critical for a being having consciousness of self. In sexual reproduction, I have said that the objective aspects were ultimately the same as in Sisyphus division. But when we examine the human experience of this in eroticism, we seem to have come a long way from these fundamental aspects and their objective reality. Particularly in eroticism, our feelings of plethora is not connected with the consciousness of engendering life. One might even say that the fuller the erotic pleasure, the less conscious we are of the children who may result from it. On the other hand, the depression following upon the final spasm may give a foretaste of death. But the anguish of death and death itself are at the antipodes of pleasure. If a reconciliation between the objective reality of reproduction and the subjective experience of eroticism is possible, it has some other basis. One thing is fundamental. The objective fact of reproduction calls into question within the subjective consciousness the feeling of self, the feeling of being, and of the limits of the isolated being. It questions the discontinuity with which the feeling of self is necessarily bound up because that furnishes its limits. Even a vague feeling of self belongs to a discontinuous being. But this discontinuity is never absolute. With sexuality particularly, a sense of the existence of others beyond the self-feeling suggests a possible continuity as opposed to the original discontinuity. Other individuals in sexuality are continually putting forward the possibility of continuity. Others are continually threatening a rent in the seamless garment of the separate individuality. Throughout the vicissitudes of animal life, those others, those fellow creatures are there, just off stage. They form a background of neutral figures, a simple one perhaps, but one that undergoes a critical change in times of sexual activity. At that moment the other individual does not yet appear positively. It is negatively linked to the disturbed violence of the plethora. Each being contributes to the self-negation of the other, yet the negation is not by any means a recognition of the other as a partner. This attraction seems to be a matter less of similarity between the two than of the plethora of the other. The violence of the one goes out to meet the violence of the other. On each side there is an inner compulsion to get out of the limits of individual discontinuity. There is a meeting between two beings projected beyond their limits by the sexual orgasm, slowly for the female, but often for the male with fulminating force. At the moment of conjunction, the animal couple is not made up of two discontinuous beings drawing close together, uniting in a current of momentary continuity. There is no real union. Two individuals in the grip of violence brought together by the preordained reflexes of sexual intercourse share in a state of crisis in which both are beside themselves. Both creatures are simultaneously open to continuity, but nothing persists in their imperfect awareness. The crisis over, the discontinuity of each is intact. This crisis is simultaneously the most intense and the least significant. Fundamental characteristics of the subjective experience of eroticism. During this examination of the animal experience of sexuality, I have moved some way from the objective facts of sexual reproduction commented upon a little earlier. I have been endeavouring to see the way clear through the subjective experience of animals, starting from a few facts drawn from the life of infinitesimal beings. I have been guided by our human subjective experience and my inevitable awareness of what is lacking in animal experience. To tell the truth, I have scarcely added anything to such suppositions as are permissible if a broad foundation is to be laid. Moreover, I have been stating the obvious. I have not given consideration to the objective facts of sexual reproduction in order to ignore them henceforth, however. Eroticism is the meeting place where all these considerations crop up again. With human life, we are fairly and squarely inside subjective experience. The objective elements we perceive are finally reduced to their subjective terms. I believe that the transitions from this continuity to continuity in eroticism are what they are because of the knowledge of death that, from the word go, connects the rupture of discontinuity and the consequent glide towards a potential continuity with death. We may perceive these feelings from without, but if we did not already feel them from within, their significance would escape us. There is also a leap to be made from the objective fact showing us the necessity of death linked to the superabundance of life, across to the dizzy confusion which the subjective experience of death brings to mind. This disturbance, together with a plethora of sexual activity, brings a profound disquiet in its train. If I had not already realized from outside that they were identical, how should I have recognized in the paradoxical experiences of plethora and swoon bound up within each other, the movement of the individual transcending in death the always provisional discontinuity of life? The first obvious thing about eroticism is the way that an ordered, parsimonious and shuttered reality is shaken by a plethoric disorder. Animal sexuality brings out this same plethoric disorder, but no barrier of resistance is raised against it. Animal disorder is freely dissipated in untrammeled violence. The rupture is consummated, the stormy flood subsides, and the solitude of the individual closes in upon it once more. The only modification of individual discontinuity possible for the animal is death. Either the animal dies, or else when the tumult has died down, its discontinuity remains intact. In human life, on the other hand, sexual violence causes a wound that rarely heals of its own accord. It has to be closed and will not even remain closed without constant attention based on anguish. Primary anguish bound up with sexual disturbance signifies death. The violence of this disturbance reopens in the mind of the man experiencing it, who also knows what death is, the abyss that death once revealed. The violence of death and sexual violence, when they are linked together, have this dual significance. On the one hand, the convulsions of the flesh are more acute when they are near to a blackout, and on the other, a blackout, as long as there is enough time, makes physical pleasure more exquisite. Mortal anguish does not necessarily make for sensual pleasure, but that pleasure is more deeply felt during mortal anguish. Erotic activity is not always as overtly sinister as this. It is not always a crack in the system, but secretly and at the deepest level the crack belongs intimately to human sensuality and is the mainspring of pleasure. Fear of dying makes us catch our breath, and in the same way we suffocate in the moment of crisis. In principle, eroticism seems at first sight the very opposite of this horrifying paradox. It is a plethora of the genital organs. An animal impulse in us is the cause of the crisis, but the organs do not freely enter this state of chance. It cannot take place without the consent of our will. It upsets an ordered system on which our efficiency and reputation depend. In fact, the individual splits up and his unity is shattered from the first instant of the sexual crisis. Just then the plethoric life of the body comes up against the mind's resistance. Even an apparent harmony is not enough. Beyond consent, the convulsions of the flesh demand silence and the spirit's absence. The physical urge is curiously foreign to human life, loosed without reference to it as long as it remains silent and keeps away. The being yielding to that urge is human no longer, but, like the beasts, a prey of blind forces in action, wallowing in blindness and oblivion. An indefinite general taboo is set up against that violence, known to us less from outside forces than directly, through the subjective knowledge that its nature is irreconcilable with our basic humanity. There is no formula for this general taboo. In the structure of acceptable behaviours, only inessential aspects are seen, varying according to persons and circumstances, not to speak of times and places. What Christian theology says about the sins of the flesh shows as much through the ineffectualness of the prohibitions proclaimed as through the numerous outspoken comments. In Victorian England, for example, the gratuitousness, the inconsistency, the violence answering violence of the reactions against the taboo. Only the actual experience of states of normal sexual activity and the clash between them and socially approved conduct allows us to recognise that this activity has its inhuman side. The organ's plethora induces reactions alien to the normal run of human behaviour. A rush of blood upsets the balance on which life is based. A madness suddenly takes possession of a person. That madness is well known to us, but we can easily picture the surprise of anyone who did not know about it and who, by some device, witnessed unseen the passionate lovemaking of some woman who had struck him as particularly distinguished. He would think she was sick, just as mad dogs are sick, just as if some mad bitch had usurped the personality of the dignified hostess of a little while back. Sickness is not putting it strongly enough, though. For the time being, the personality is dead. For the time being, its death gives the bitch full scope, and she takes advantage of the silence, of the absence of the dead woman. The bitch wallows noisily in all that silence and absence. The return of the personality would freeze her and put an end to the sensual delight she has abandoned herself to. The loosing of the sexual urge is not always as violent as I have described it, but this is nonetheless a fair picture of the diametrically opposite poles. The urge is, first of all, a natural one, but it cannot be given free rein without barriers being torn down, so much so that the natural urge and the demolished obstacles are confused in the mind. The natural urge means a barrier destroyed. The barrier destroyed means the natural urge. Demolished barriers are not the same as death, but just as the violence of death overturns irrevocably the structure of life, so temporarily and partially does sexual violence. Indeed, Christian theology identifies the moral degradation following the sins of the flesh with death. Inevitably linked with the moment of climax, there is a minor rupture suggestive of death. And conversely, the idea of death may play a part in setting sensuality in motion. This mostly adds up to a sense of transgression dangerous to general stability and the conservation of life, and without it the instincts could not run their course unhindered. But transgression is not only objectively necessary to this freedom, for it can happen that, unless we see that transgression as taking place, we no longer have the feeling of freedom that the full accomplishment of the sexual act demands. So much so that a scabrous situation is sometimes necessary to a blasé individual for him to reach the peak of enjoyment, or, if not the situation itself, an imaginary one lived out like a daydream during intercourse. Such a situation is not always a terrifying one. Many women cannot reach their climax without pretending to themselves that they are being raped. But deep within the significant break, there dwells a boundless violence. Footnote. There are widespread and staggering possibilities of harmony between erotic urges and violence. I am thinking of a passage that Marcel Amy, Uranus, Gallimard, page 151 to 152, which has the merit of presenting the incident in all its banality in an immediate and accessible way. Here is the last sentence. The sight of these two cautious, dismal and mean-spirited specimens of the petit bourgeois eyeing the victims from their Renaissance dining room and titillating each other and jigging up and down in the folds of the curtains just like dogs. The passage describes the execution of some militiamen, preceded by other horrible and bloody incidents observed by a couple who sympathised with the victims. The paradox of the general taboo on sexual freedom, if not on sexuality. The remarkable thing about the sex taboo is that it is fully seen in transgression. It is inculcated partly through education, but never resolutely formulated. Education proceeds as much by silence as by muffled warnings. The taboo is discovered directly by a furtive and at first partial exploration of the forbidden territory. At first, nothing could be more mysterious. We are admitted to the knowledge of a pleasure in which the notion of pleasure is mingled with mystery, suggestive of the taboo that fashions the pleasure at the same time as it condemns it. The revelation through transgression has certainly not remained constant throughout the ages. 50 years ago, the irony of sex education was more obvious still, but everywhere, and doubtless from the earliest times, our sexual activity is sworn to secrecy, and everywhere, though to a variable degree, it appears contrary to our dignity, so that the essence of eroticism is to be found in the inextricable confusion of sexual pleasure and taboo. In human terms, the taboo never makes an appearance without suggesting sexual pleasure, nor does the pleasure without evoking the taboo. The basis is a natural urge, and in childhood the natural urge acts alone. But there is never any truly human pleasure at that age, and anyway, we can never remember it. I can imagine objections and exceptions, but they cannot shake such a plain fact. In the human sphere, sexual activity has broken away from animal simplicity. It is in essence a transgression, not, after the taboo, a return to primitive freedom. Transgression belongs to humanity, given shape by the business of work. Transgression itself is organised. Eroticism as a whole is an organised activity, and this is why it changes over the years. I shall try to give a picture of eroticism seen in its diversity and its changes. Eroticism first appears in transgression of the first degree, for that is what marriage is when all is said and done. But it is only really present in more complex forms in which the quality of transgression is stressed progressively more and more. The quality of transgression, or in other words, the sinfulness.